this pain away. I've prayed before, can't tell you what for.
Good morning, everyone. This is the last video I'm going to do for MOvember, and I'm really excited because I've got somebody that I spent a lot of time reading in my early recovery, and there was a lot of men in Australia that were getting together in small groups and really trying on a lot of what we were getting from America. And it was the mythopoetic part of the men's movement seemed to come together with a couple of amazing voices. And one of those voices was John Lee. He wrote The Flying Boy, which a lot of men in relationships grabbed hold of and with both hands. And then books that followed early on, like At My Father's Wedding, which was reflecting off a poem of Robert Bly, who I'll ask John about in a second, then took us deeper. From there on, I remember us running retreats on healing the father-son wound, facing the fire, learning to express anger appropriately, which has been a book I still recommend. I haven't even got it on my bookshelf because it's in someone else's hands right now. I just want people to have that information immediately. And the book that I'm going to ask John about also is a new book that he's got called Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic, Resetting the Patterns of a Man's Lives and Loves. And so, John, welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for having me this morning and having this conversation with me and saying these wonderful things about my books and my work. And so I'm very glad to be talking with you.
Thanks, John. Look, the thing that, I mean, I've seen you when you've come to Australia, and I've had the pleasure of spending some intensive time with you. And I just had a friend of mine over there, and he texted me from Dallas Airport saying, I'm on the way home, looking forward to speaking to you, and hanging out with John Lee was better than I thought it was going to be. And so you...
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. Thank you for sending him. He was a wonderful, wonderful man to work with.
Look, I think, John, that's the thing. When I've been in your presence, and you talk a lot about mentoring. You're an elder now, and it's what happens when we blow out birthday candles each year. If you're lucky enough to do that, and you've done your own personal work, you become a mentor and elder. What's that been like for you to start in your own, having to do your own work, and then now being able to support so many men and women?
Well, it's an honor, and it's also kind of frightening how fast time goes. I wrote the Flying Boy book when I was 33. And I just turned 65 last month. And it's like, where did all that time go? And one of the interesting things about being the age that I am now and having given talks and written 23 books and stuff is that in some ways I get to live into a place that I was sort of prematurely hurled into in my 30s and early 40s, because there wasn't a lot of us doing the work at the time. I was looked to for some guidance, sort of in ways that I hadn't had the years to be a guide.
I appreciate that, John. I remember us being at a men's gathering down in Tasmania in the late 80s, and they put all the men, there was about 100 men in a circle, and they put the elder men at one end, and we went by age down to the youngest man. And the theme of that was no one felt that they sort of were ready for that, either that warrior stage or that king stage. And the elders spoke of that, of feeling thrust into, due to age, an expectation that maybe we should know more than we do. What have you learned about that, in a sense of being thrust in because you're passionate about something? And what's that journey been like to then, as you've spoken about it, wrote about it, what have you learned along the way?
Well, mostly, Steve, that the older I get, the less I know for sure. I was so much more certain about everything at 35 and 40 than I am at 65. I appreciate the longevity that my career has had, and that's due in large part to people like yourself who have read my books and supported me over the years. It's really kind of a fascinating time in my life to be thinking about, what I'm going to be doing for the next 10 or 20 years as I move into my 70s and hopefully my 80s. Robert Bly, my dear friend and colleague and mentor to tens of thousands of men all over the world, he worked up until he was about 86, 87. And I remember talking to him maybe when he was 85 or something, and he still hadn't felt like he'd really accomplished much of anything in terms of what he hoped to bring to men's work and men's issues. And I kept affirming him and validating him and saying, listen, you've changed the world, old friend. You've changed the world.
Yeah.
Part
of our experience, part of the men's MOvember campaign, I held a small event here at the house, and I had about 10 men show up. We had some food, and we watched 1,000 Years of Joy. And a lot of those guys, there was probably 3 or 4 at least, we'd sat in early circles in the late 80s listening to Robert Bly's Iron John, and so we had that history with him. And you're exactly right, all the way on the other side of this planet.
Right.
Hearing him talk about that, and then inspiring, like I imagine the At My Father's Wedding book was certainly part of that relationship that you would have had with Robert and being inspired. How important is having mentors of the heart in your life?
Well, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for Robert and John Bradshaw and all these incredible people. To have been able to have worked with Robert for 20 years, we would do anywhere from 6 to 10 to 12 events a year. It was just one of the greatest experiences of my life and what was so good about it, Steve, is that he mentored me, I mentored him. We never had the father-son dynamic because by the time that he and I had actually started working together, I'd done so much work around my own father wound that I didn't have to place any of that on him. But I got to see how many men wanted him to be the father they never had. And now at 65, I get a little bit more of that myself, occasionally. But now it's like an honor. I just did a men's weekend 3 or 4 weekends ago, and just to still be sitting in a circle of men talking about these issues 30 years later. What can anybody say except to be so grateful to have been able to participate. You folks over in Australia, the 3 or 4 times that y'all have invited me over there. God, it was so great being with y'all because it was so clear that men's issues were men's issues, father-son stuff, mother-son stuff. It didn't matter what part of the planet you lived on. We all have this in common.
Yes, yeah, I hear you. You've just written the new book that you've written is Breaking the Mother-Son Dynamic, and I see this a lot with working with men too. The estranged fathers, the absent fathers, the boys that either grow up in a single parent home or grow up in a family where dad's there but he's not there, and then that enmeshed relationship with that can form then between a mother and son that then plays out in their adult relationship. So what what inspired you to write that book, and what's some of the messages in it that you wanted to sort of get people thinking about and talking about?
Well, the biggest thing is that the mother-son relationship has always been sort of a taboo topic to discuss. When we first started in the 80s with the men's work, we went directly to the father issues and we tackled them head on, but men were very reluctant all over the world to really talk about the mothers in as honest a way as we did about our fathers. And what we knew deep down inside was that the relationship to the mother was impacting us, especially with our wives, our lovers, our ability to be parents, because this was a relationship that had its own kind of baggage, but no one wanted to discuss. One time, Robert and I did a 2-day event in Chicago, and the day-long Saturday event was called Healing the Father-Son Wound, and we had 350 men attend. And the next day, at the same site and advertised along with the next day, Sunday, we did a day-long called Healing the Mother-Son Wound, and we had 75 men attend.
Wow, you couldn't get a more graphic sort of expression of what you're saying right there.
Right, and that's why I knew I had to write this book, but I also had to write it at a time where I had enough age and enough distance from my own mothering to be able to say something that would still be respectful of women. I tried very, very hard to be very respectful of mothers in that book. And in that book, I hopefully gave mothers a bunch of tools to help separate from their sons, and also for young mothers to usher their young boys into a different kind of adulthood than some of us had. Because again, you know, my mother, father, your mother, father, you know, they didn't have the kind of information that we now have such a easy access to.
Yeah, I must say that's true. I was thinking when you were talking earlier about you and that early work with Robert, that if you, you walked into a esoteric bookstore or just a general bookstore, and there would be a women's section that would be substantial, and there would be like a shelf, if you were lucky, dedicated to books for men. And now that paradigm has shifted. That, like, as you said, when you gave Robert that feedback about changing the world, I think there was you men that sort of pioneered that work, and I put yourself in that category, John, that took a risk and shared things. And in a way, very personally, I like what you said about your relationship with Robert. It must have been a gift for him to not have that father energy put onto him, because you'd done your own work. And this is leading up to just a question around one of the things I've liked about the accessibility of your information is that you share a lot of your own story, and which makes it really personal to the listener. It's not like you're all reader when you're reading your books, that you're not. And I've never felt as though, this guy's studied this and he's distant from it. You've lived it. And it certainly gave me hope when I read it, because I identified with you. Well, I imagine, like you said, that you get that energy now yourself. Well, have you, I asked the longest questions in the universe. You might have picked this up. One thing I heard you say, John, that's a reflection of how maybe you've protected yourself. I heard you say at a conference once that because of where you'd come from, and because of the likelihood when you give away of yourself that you want to please folks, that you learnt not to accept personal feedback after talking engagements because you weren't repackaged yet, ready to hear it with differentiation. Right. And I've always remembered that. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about how you've looked after yourself, giving so much to others and not fallen into, or maybe have fallen into some traps and then learnt lessons?
Well, one of the things that we share in common and is our recovery background, and so that was a big part of what I tried to contribute to the men's movement in general was, trying to be sober men and taking care of ourselves and really good self-care. What you're talking about is in my book, Facing the Fire, that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
There's a section in that book called Saying No to Criticism.
Mm.
Unsolicited criticism after a lecture or a workshop. Somebody would want to come up and say, I really liked what you were saying, but, I learned at a very early age to have a shield or a glass jar around me at these events, because the people that were coming to these events were just as wounded as I was. And so self-care and recovery from codependency especially, and alcohol and work addiction, all the stuff that I struggled with, basically what I did was just try to approach each of these issues in my own life and then try to write about them in a way that the average person could read and understand, but also the academic or the professional could still glean something from as well.
Yeah, we have certainly achieved that, John. I think that's one of the things I've loved about your work is that vulnerability, but then the courage to sort of to speak in a way and about subjects, as you said, about that mother relationship, but even fathers too. I remember us getting together and listening to you had released a tape called "Healing the Father-Son Wound," and we'd spend a weekend listening to that tape and then just getting men to share about their experience of what it was like to live with dad, and now the writing that you're doing about the working so much with women, and it seems to be later in your writing career. The other book I remember getting from you was Courting a Woman's Soul, and you've talked a lot about loving in the last 10 years of your writing. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was something that Robert and I talked about very openly at all our conferences in the 80s. Right from the beginning, he and I and some of the others that started out in the 80s with this, we wanted to make it clear, especially Robert and I, we wanted to make it clear that this work that we were doing with men, with fathers and sons, was to make us better husbands, lovers, parents, and really my belief is that all the work that I've written about has been in sort of, in a way, it's been about my failures to love and to be loved, and what I've learned from those failures, and still, this new book that I'm just now finishing called Where Do I Go From Her? I hope and pray that it's the best thing that I have yet to say about love. Because that's where Robert and I and the whole men's thing always wanted to be headed, is in some kind of full, masculine, strong but vulnerable, emotionally intelligent, poetic men who could say what they felt and say what they needed and teach men how to do the same. And so what we got, I'm happy to say, is more men who are in their 20s and 30s who are far more loving, far better parents, far more emotionally intelligent than we were in our 20s, 30s, and 40s. See, that's about all the energy I got, bud.
Well, John, thank you very much for being able to do this.
Now,
I know.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to thank you. personally for gifting this, because you're gifting this to men, and I'll do my best to make sure as many people can hear this, and I will put at the back end of this video how to contact you. It's wonderful that you're so accessible for over there in Mentone, Alabama. Is that how I say that?
Yes, Mentone, Alabama, and Austin, Texas.
Life just like a crazy horse, just gotta hang on, you gotta stay the course. Sometimes you duck the branches, sometimes it hit your face. Just blink your eyes, spit the bark from your teeth, feel the wind